We have rang the alarm bell loud and clear.
Once in a century.
The season has been suspended.
Princess Cruises has suspended service.
Disney is shutting its U.S. theme parks.
A global health emergency disrupts everything.
Hospitals are bracing for a huge spike in patients.
The jury seats are empty.
Schools might be closed for 4 weeks.
Panic shopping has put an enormous strain on grocery stores.
This week on Open Record,
issuing a safer at home order isn't something I thought we'd have to do.
we reflect on the COVID-19 pandemic
This is just a temporary moment of time.
5 years later.
As of right now, you are all officially rebels like us.
From the FOX6 studios, this is Open Record. I'm Bryan Polcyn, and I am joined as always by Sarah Smith, Open Record's executive producer. Hello, Sarah.
Hello.
And we are joined by FOX6 investigator and news content manager Amanda St. Hilaire. Hello, Amanda.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, and do we have some things to talk about this week?
We do.
We are recording this episode on Wednesday, March 12th. As we record, exactly 5 years has passed since Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers issued Executive Order 72, declaring a health emergency in response to the 2019 coronavirus, better known as COVID-19. At the time, FOX6 News had just recently started a fledgling little audio-only podcast.
Cute little thing, little baby.
Called Open Record. It soon became a daily staple of our emergency coverage. We're going to reflect on that and so much more when we come right back. We are back on Open Record. So when we look back 5 years, the COVID-19 pandemic, 5 years ago today as we record this.
5 years, I read it in the script, and I know it's been 5 years, but I just need to throw out there that there's still a holy bleep moment when you say it's been 5 years.
Well, it's also crazy how much our lives changed seemingly forever and then got back to almost normal, but in some ways not.
Yeah.
It's just so much has happened in 5 years.
Yeah.
For someone being born now who will be in school at one day and this will be a history lesson and that's all it will be.
Yeah, I don't like that.
It's hard to imagine that that's all it's going to be. But in any case, I want to start this with sort of the personal, because I think for everyone there is sort of a personal memory of, while the pandemic didn't start on a day, there's a moment where it really became like, oh, this is really going to be a thing for all of us. For a while, it was like, oh, that's an overseas thing, and don't fly to China or whatever it might be. But then it hit, and I want to know, what were you doing? What do you remember, Sarah?
I think we were kind of talking about it a little bit yesterday, but it was Friday. Well, pictures starting to pop up on my Alexa and my, Facebook memories of, we went on a trip to Florida. It was 5 years ago. And when we were flying, it was kind of like people had masks on, some had full hazmat suits on. And it was kind of like, oh, it was a thing that was there, but not really here. And we flew back on a Sunday. By that Friday, which was Friday the 13th, the kids, they were like, we're shutting down school. They're going to do school from home. And at that point, what did that mean? What does that look like? So things got real crazy real quick, and they were collecting school. You had to do a drive-through of collecting schoolwork. And
So what day were you flying on?
a Sunday. So that was Sunday the 8th or something like that, March 8th. And then by the 13th, then the NBA shut down midweek. And then it was school is we're doing this.
Is it just me, or I feel like was that when everybody went, oh my gosh,
The
this is
NBA.
serious?
That was a
My
big
husband
deal.
and I were just talking about this
Yeah.
because we had been talking to our pediatrician. So at the time we had one child and she was almost one. We were flying to New York where a lot of this was popping up. And we were like, hey, is this safe? It's February. And she said, I don't think it's going to be that big of a deal. Great.
Narrator.
Not that we ever held her to that.
That big of a deal, yeah.
It would be a big deal. And so I was kind of in denial for a little bit. And we're in the news, but we almost become desensitized to it because it's and another update and another update. But that moment when the NBA said we're shutting down, that's what my husband and I looked at each other and went, whoa.
Yeah.
And then after that was when we got a message from daycare that's in 1 hour, we will be shutting down indefinitely. And I remember racing from here. At that point, I think our news director at the time, Jim, literally chucked a laptop at me because I didn't have a laptop. he said, in case you can't come back. And it was our
Yeah.
podcast recording
Yeah.
laptop.
Yeah.
I had it. And I'm at daycare, and it's like, those of you who have kids in daycare know, it's like they have a ton of stuff there. So it's like every
Schlepping
parent
all the-
has
yeah.
their arms full of all the stuff. I have like bags of frozen breast milk, and we're like
Yeah.
taking all this
Yeah.
stuff out to our car. And it's like, okay, like maybe for a couple weeks.
Yeah, 2 weeks. I still remember.
The 2 weeks. So you guys keep talking. That's why I think the NBA was a moment for all of us that
Yeah.
we went, this is real. But at the moment that I heard that, I was in a swimming pool in Mexico.
Yeah, you were.
And we had a pool or a group of like 40 people, and we all have, frosty mugs in our hands, and it's sunny, and there's reggae music in the background, and it's fantastic, and palm trees. And I remember my wife was on the phone, and I'm like, get off your phone, you're on vacation. And she's on the phone, and she's like, my sister says the NBA is shutting down the season, and the boys, her boys at the time were at Concordia University, and they're shutting down school. And they're sending them home. And my first thought was, what an overreaction. This is crazy. That can't, look
Even
at
when
look
you
at the
got
thumb.
back from Mexico, you were kind of like, are we blowing this out of proportion?
Well, because the thing is, so here's the thing.
you
and
were
I'm
still
a
on your
bit
vacation high.
I'm a bit embarrassed to admit it, but it's true. After she hung up the phone, everyone's talking about the world going crazy and toilet paper's already running out. And we just went, hey, and a conga line through the pool. Now, where I knew that it was actually serious is I thought,
Yeah.
well, in Mexico, they're sure not taking it serious right now.
Yeah.
A couple of days later, before we left to come home, there was like a coffee bar you could go to in the morning. They had turned that around, put signs up, no joint, coffee
Yeah.
bar or whatever. And all of a sudden the resort was changing and they were locking things down. And we're like, we need to get out of here.
Let's go.
Before we're stuck in
Yeah.
Mexico.
Yeah.
We flew back and we came into the international terminal in Chicago, and there were news crews waiting outside, like the last people to get in. And so it was like, wow, we made it back. But that's
I'm really happy you didn't get stuck in Mexico.
I am
Yeah.
happy we didn't get stuck
Because
here either, although
with
the
everything
weather
that
was
happened
nice.
next, also, like, I would miss your company, but selfishly for me to do everything that we did as a
Oh,
team.
we'll talk
next,
about that.
If you were stuck in Mexico, would have been
More of a challenge.
So that's our
journey.
sort of personal memories. But
Yeah.
then work was like, so you've got to figure out your daycare and what are you going to do with the kids? And
Yeah.
they're going to be home from
Right.
school. But also, how are we going to do the news from home? And that doesn't make any sense. But we were getting sent off. And I remember we had just maybe for 6 months been doing this podcast. And it was
Yeah.
like a weekly thing, right?
Yeah.
So, and I don't know if you came up with this, if Jim did. I don't know where this all came from, who came up with this idea, but there were these little recording devices, audio recording devices with a professional microphone that attached to them. He said, you guys are going to take these home
Yeah.
and you're going to talk over Zoom.
Was that a you thing? I remember. us
Yeah.
going, what about
I
the podcast?
I remember going around and because you're right. At this point now, we all have laptops and that's just like commonplace. But like in the before times, we just didn't have laptops.
Yeah.
So everyone was going around the building going, okay, is there a spare laptop? Okay, you get that one. You get this. So we pilfered everything. And
Yeah.
part of it was, well, how are we going to do the podcast? Are we going to keep doing the podcast? Well, we better be prepared. So at the time I was working with the chief photographer, we're getting those microphones and we're testing them. And yeah, it was wild.
So
Now-
we had these little portable microphones we got
Yeah.
to bring home. You got one. I got one.
And by the way, I
And
had never
Jenna?
done a
Yeah.
Zoom call at that time
Yeah.
in
I
my
didn't know
life.
what
What
was.
is Zoom? Yeah, right.
And
Zoom
we-
was the show I watched as a kid on PBS.
Wow.
Yeah.
So we get on a Zoom call. We would be able to hear each other and
Yeah.
do the communication that way, and then we would record independent audio streams that our
Yes.
editor would then have to
Oh my
put
gosh,
together. We were recording, and I have a picture here of which Dave can flash up for everyone else, but it is a picture of what things. So we always talk about FOX6 undercover
Yeah.
investigations. We were literally, Dave, if you can put this up now, but here we
Yeah.
are. Doing our undercover investigation. There's
Under-
Jenna.
Because you
For the
needed the
audio
covers for the
quality.
audio
Because
quality.
we're at home,
yeah.
and for audio quality, you wanted to sort of keep that audio, muffled or whatever close. So
Right.
we were all literally under blankets talking at 8 o'clock in the morning because we would record the podcast, and then we would have to go and do our regular daily news coverage.
Yeah.
And
So we went from weekly
to
daily.
because this was an emergency, and literally I recall every single day there was something that came out where people
Yes.
said, well, how does that work?
Yeah, the
Well, what
news
about
was
that?
developing by the
and
hour.
it really made the podcast appropriate because we could talk in depth about
Yes.
how that does work, or can he do that,
Yeah.
or what happens with this, and we were able to go into more depth. it was a really great thing for Fox 6 News. It was a really great thing for this podcast because I think that's where we really got our feet under us. But it was also really demanding.
It was very demanding.
Daily podcast, and every day we were cutting these cold opens to introduce the subject. We were coming up on the fly, sometimes 15 minutes before the podcast. What are we talking about today?
Yeah.
And we would come up with what that was.
And becoming fast experts.
Yeah, becoming quick experts on topics, and then producing that, sending it all off to Dave, and then going on with our day. And I was working on a coffee table in my basement where I was on the couch kind of hunched over.
Yeah.
My back was killing me.
You and I both eventually ended up with slip discs in our neck.
Yes, that's true.
At the same
That's
time.
true.
And I think it was from all of the...
It is true. We both ended up
Yeah.
with the same thing, and I ended up getting an injection because it was so bad. But
same.
we got to a point though where the workload was like, we're doing this every day, and we thought 2 weeks. That's the whole thing.
Right.
2 weeks to flatten the curve. Well, 2 months later, we're still doing daily podcasts, and I was dying.
Yeah. Bryan is approaching our only professional argument.
It's true.
That we've had.
It's true.
Or personal.
I think we
It's
were
our
in the
only
same
real
place,
argument.
but we both needed to vent a little about how we were.
And it was a Sunday night, and we didn't know what the podcast episode was going to be the next day.
And we were taking turns at the time.
We were
like,
taking
tomorrow's yours,
being
and you
the
take
leader.
the next one.
Yeah.
Right, yeah.
It was like you sent out an SOS, and
Bryan made Amanda cry.
well, that's not hard. In fairness to you, that is not hard to do. If I feel any strong emotion, it just leaks out of my face. But it was, and so it was like, who was going to do the podcast the next day? But then it turned into the daily podcasting being unsustainable. I did not have a mature reaction to this because I was like, well, I've done it on this day and this day and this day. Because it was like, what are you whining about, dude? I got a 1-year-old. Like,
Right,
it was not a productive conversation. Fortunately, you're always the kind of person I've been able to, like, we were able to calm down, hash it out. I think Sarah was a little worried there.
I remember standing in my garage and I was on the phone with you, and it was just, okay, I really, like, you started it with I will do whatever it takes to get this news on, and I will do it, and I appreciate the opportunity, but I can't do this every day, and something's got to,
And I was so adamant, like, we have to do this every day.
Yeah.
Probably a little overly rigid with it.
I think it was a function, though, of how much we were producing. I still am. I find it remarkable the number of episodes we put out while still coming in afterwards and doing daily packages, daily stories.
Yes.
So it was a time. And I'm not, other people had much harder jobs, I think, of nurses that were working double shifts and things like that.
Yeah.
This isn't a feel of sorry for us, but it was a function of how chaotic that time was and how much news was coming out at the time. Every day there was something we had never confronted before.
How much news? And I think a lot of people felt this because your brain, and I forget the term for it, but when you make a lot of decisions, your brain essentially overheats. There's a way better scientific way to describe this. Your brain doesn't actually overheat, but you just you shut down because every decision you make is taking all of this emotional energy. Well, think about how many decisions by the hour everybody had to make because we were in this unknown territory. So all the small things about what to do with your kids. Is this safe? Is this not safe? What's the risk and reward? You think about your household and your own personal health and how everything has changed at work. I think no matter what profession you were in, there's a reason that there was a lot of talk about mental health during this time, because just navigating that kind of unknown thing with that much uncertainty and knowing that you're not the only person you're responsible for.
Yeah.
That is so much pressure, and you get used to it until one day it just kind of builds up.
Now, I could see our time getting away from us. There's some things I want to talk about, and that I think was really interesting when I got back from Mexico, when you got sent home from daycares and everything else. Tony Evers' order came down on March 12th.
Yeah.
St. Patrick's Day was 5 days later.
Yeah.
And boy, St. Patrick's Day in Milwaukee is a celebration.
Right.
But we had a lot of questions about what was going to happen as these two things collided. And we're going to talk about that when we come right back. And we are back on Open Record. So March 12th of 2020, the governor issues the safer at home order. But bars and restaurants at the time were still open. I think it started with there was like a limitation on public gatherings of 250
yes, it was 250,
people.
Yep.
And then it was reduced to public gatherings of 10 people.
Yep.
And that came down literally the day before St. Patrick's Day.
Okay.
So we were seeing that there were some bars and restaurants that were saying, look, we're going to close down.
Right.
There's no point.
Yep.
But there were others that were publicly advertising, we're going to stay open. The governor's not going to tell us what to do. And one of them was a bar that no longer exists. It was in Brookfield at the time, Saloon on Calhoun.
Saloon on Calhoun.
They were boasting proudly that they were going to stay open and it didn't matter what the governor said. And we thought, well, let's just go see what this looks like. And Amanda and I paid a special trip to Saloon on Calhoun just to observe what was happening.
And by the way, I look back on this and I did not fully comprehend the potential risk we were taking by going to this. So older, wiser Amanda would have told younger, dumber Amanda that maybe this wasn't a great idea, but it turned into a great piece of journalism.
It did,
Here is the outcome of that as Dave will bring this up now.
It's after 5 o'clock, so as of right now, you are all officially rebels like us.
While most bars and restaurants were shutting down on Tuesday, Brookfield's Saloon on Calhoun kept the party going.
Trying to stay in a group of less than 10 and 6 feet apart from each other, not being facetious.
Hours after Governor Evers banned all public gatherings larger than 10 people, we counted as many as 31.
We're going to keep this thing going because you all have made a conscious choice to be here. You understand what's at risk?
Even in the face of a global pandemic and local detection of community transmission of the coronavirus, saloon owner Dave Daler said he is fighting for freedom.
People are going to die. We don't want anybody to die. But over 80% get a cough. We're killing our economy and we're killing an entire industry over a cough.
Daler's defiance could come at a price. The Waukesha County DA tells Fox 6 state statutes give local police the authority to enforce emergency orders.
If you don't want to go, we're not going to go. The first person that leaves is me in handcuffs.
The DA says failure to comply could lead to fines or even a misdemeanor criminal charge.
So if I have to stand as a sole entrepreneur, proprietor, concerned citizen, freedoms, whatever it is, I want to stand for freedom.
We are going to party.
Bryan, Polcyn, Fox 6 investigators.
So that was right at the very beginning, and we were still kind of trying to figure out, like you said, we were there in the middle of that, just trying to figure out what was going on. Now, 31 people on St. Patrick's Day wouldn't normally be a big crowd, but when the governor's limit was 10, and by the way, just before, I think it was right before we got there, or maybe even while we were there, is when the order came out that, in fact, at 5 p.m., bars and restaurants were closing all across the state. And they stayed open past 5 p.m. And that's when the announcement came out where he said, you're all rebels just like us. They were defying the governor's order. And we know that this became a very controversial subject as time went on. I think that was kind of a microcosm of what was to come.
I remember recording a portion of the podcast episode about this in the parking lot.
We did,
yes,
Saloon
you did.
On Calhoun.
Yep.
Yeah, I was still eating beef jerky when we started. I remember that.
That became weirdly a part of the podcast episode. But it's crazy to look back on that. And if I remember right, so we go in, we are observing the crowd and making notes and recording video. And then afterwards was when you said, hey, I'm a journalist. We're doing this story tonight. Yeah. And he ended up talking. But just hearing that first bite, and I saw you react to it too. People will die. Jolts you. And as much as we talk about the before times, like this is serious.
Yeah, and it
people did die.
People did die, but there were also many people who said, and for months after, it's just a cough, right? So this became this ongoing controversy. As people are dying, other people are saying it's just not that serious. And that episode, that particular episode of Open Record, was the reason that I have this coffee mug. If you look, it's this is the 2021 National Murrow Award winner. That was one of 3 entries on that, or one of 3 entries in that entry to the Murrow Awards that won a national podcast, Murrow, and really I think was kind of the thing that launched this into what it has become since then. We didn't have video then, but within a couple of years we've added the video component, and Cale Zimney, who's right across from me over here, put together this fantastic studio, which is now a huge part of the content we're putting on Fox Local and putting out on YouTube. So this has become a really great space, but I really think stuff like that is what made this what it is.
Because it was very centered. The podcast was centered on the investigations that you guys would do, and then what Jenna Sachs would do with Contact 6. And it was less maybe topical and more the stories that you're doing, talking about, remember it was like what it took to get them, the stories. And
and I've always liked that ability to go beyond, because, you work on a story for 6 months or 3 months or whatever, and you get 5 or 6 minutes on TV. That's an eternity on local news.
Yeah.
Your scripts are longer than 5 or 6 minutes.
7 or 8 minutes,
Okay,
9 minutes. The podcast, we have an hour, 45 minutes of actual talking content. You have the ability to talk more about what were the obstacles, why did we do what we did, and I think it really opens up a layer of transparency and also allows us to go into a little bit more depth with some of these subjects.
And that's what came in handy when we were in the midst of the beginning stages of COVID-19, right? Where there's so much to talk about and there's so much to dig through, and you have to compress it for television. And by nature, you're going to lose some context, you're going to lose some meaning. And then through having a different platform, we're able to get some of that back, because the best stories are the ones that have nuance and the ones where it's not clear cut. And if there's one thing we know about that time, it's that it's not clear cut, right? So that became the right kind of material to really dig in, and our audience was along for the ride with us.
Some of those early podcasts, we were talking about just the most basic questions, like, does the governor have this power? How far do his powers go?
I remember getting assigned that story. Can he do that? And it was like, I don't know. Can he? Like,
so you're talking to scholars. But what's so interesting is a couple of months later, the Supreme Court was weighing that very question and ultimately decided that he had surpassed his authority. But the other things we were talking about is things like, well, okay, what about masks? Should you wear them? Shouldn't you wear them? Are cloth masks any good? Should people be making them at home? How are healthcare workers going to have enough of them? I mean, there were so many questions we just didn't know. And I know one of them was immediately we started asking about how soon could they get a vaccine ready? This could take a year and a half. Well, it took about a year or a little less than a year. But nonetheless, there were questions then about who can take the vaccine. You did stories on questions about, should pregnant women be taking this vaccine?
While I was pregnant. And that's actually what launched it. So I was pregnant with kid number 2. We said, we're not going anywhere. Anyway, we might as well have another kid. And this was starting to become available. And it occurred to me that, especially because healthcare workers were the first people who had the option, pregnant healthcare workers kind of became an experiment with this. And it was hard for me to get satisfying answers, because I just wanted to know, should I or shouldn't I? I'd like someone to just tell me. And no one could tell me. And it turns out there's a historical reason why. This goes back way before COVID. And so through diving into that and through my own experience, I was able to go through and get answers about why we didn't have answers. But then also, here's a more in-depth way to think about it. Here's a framework for thinking about it and making that very personal decision.
There's so many things that change so quickly too, because I remember going to the grocery store for the first couple of times and you've got a mask on and you're like, how close can I be to people? And then I remember the worst thing for me at the grocery store was trying to get those plastic bags open because you couldn't lick your fingers, which I look back and go, probably shouldn't be doing that, right? But you couldn't, like, they were slippery. So they're slippery, but I've got a mask on. I'm like, I can't get these open. And, but there was,
I think those are what we call first world problems.
that maybe, but I think we were all going to grocery stores because we needed food, right? And restaurants were closed. And then you go, well, okay, but are we safe here at the grocery store? And then they started putting up sneeze guards, but the sneeze guards were only 1.5 feet wide. And so people would go up to the little where your credit card is, station, and they're leaning around to talk. And I'm like, well, what's the point of the sneeze? So there were so many things.
And I think that's where the investigative reporter aspect of this is interesting, because we're all the types where, okay, this is the thing we're doing. Does it work? What does the research say? And when it comes to science, things are changing, things are evolving and keeping up. So I remember you had done quite a bit of in-depth research on sneeze guards and the plexiglass and what is the efficacy of that and what does that mean? And it's just really fascinating how that skill set that we apply to so many other things became directly relevant to what the whole world was going through.
I think about how much we still see much more hand sanitizer around than ever.
Oh, yeah.
But that came out at the initial point when we thought that there was that kind of transmission, only to
Right.
find that it has nothing to do with surface contact
Right.
at all.
Mhm.
But even though we found out science said it has nothing to do with surface contact, everywhere you went, they were wiping everything down, making sure
yeah.
that it was sanitized.
Yeah.
And it was really about the aerosol or being in the room or what's in the
Mm-hmm.
air. We still today are doing, now it's not that that's bad for public health in general,
Sure.
but that was something that became such a huge focus, even though the science never really backed it up.
Well, and that's where, and there are lasting impacts of that too, right? So all of I think about what daycares went through when we did a lot of reporting on that. And the daycare situation was already kind of precarious in the United States, but specifically Wisconsin. And then enter COVID-19 and enter all these deep cleaning measures that all these centers are taking because you want to do everything you possibly can to have a clean environment. And you're talking about kids. You're talking about, someone licks the block, hands it to the next kid who licks it, or they sneeze in each other's mouths. But all of the
So true,
or
relatable.
or they sneeze in their
It is,
parents'
it is.
mouths. Not that I have personal experience with this. And all of the different things that they were doing, and a lot of it was, and you have to in those situations, you're throwing stuff against the wall to see what sticks, but then it's expensive, and then you're losing staff, and then and all of those things end up having a snowball effect. COVID-19, even though we're talking about the real start of this 5 years ago, the childcare landscape in Wisconsin is still significantly altered from that.
Well, and I think that's a good segue because I want to talk about now, 5 years later, what has changed, what's gone back to normal, and we'll look ahead to hopefully not the next pandemic, but what comes after all of this. We'll do that when we come right back. Welcome back to Open Record. So we've said it's been 5 years since the emergency order that really kind of launched the seriousness of the pandemic in Wisconsin. And I remember about a year, maybe even a year and a half after this, talking to our news director, Jim Wilson, and I asked him, when are we going to come back in the building? Like, how soon might that happen? And I remember him saying, we might never come back. This might be the future. And he was wrong, but...
Hear that, Jim? You were wrong.
He was wrong, but at the time it made sense because we had come up with a way to do things from home. Photographers were strategically stationed around the city, made some sense.
That part of that, the fact that we were able to, if you would have asked me 5 years ago, would you be able to put on a newscast from a house? And you'd be like,
laughed.
absolutely not. That sounds ridiculous.
My favorite story is still our weather expert, Stephanie Barrichello, having a green screen set up at home and the whole thing. And then just in the next room, her husband, who is a meteorologist at another television station.
Also weathering.
Also doing the weather. And they're in the same exact room. So, or same house.
It was wild to me when they were like, okay, we're going to work from home. And I was like, we're going to be able to do that? That's wild. And I'll be darned, we did newscasts. I mean, anchors were at their respective homes. Our engineers at the time went to each of their houses, set up a camera, some of which we are using today. And it's just, it's so wild to me. So that when we all started working from home, then it was, well, are we going to come back? I mean, we are able to do this.
We did lose some things along the way with that, right? Like, I feel when we talk about the television news industry, I feel very badly for people who were just starting at stations during this time, or just starting in this industry during this time, because you're more isolated. You don't have that camaraderie. You don't have the hands-on training. You're not getting the same level of feedback. I think across many industries, and there's been a lot of research about what fueled the Great Resignation, if you will. And in some ways, it led to some very positive changes in terms of the way we manage, and employers being forced to really think about the well-being of the employee in order to keep the employee. But we lost some things with that too. So when Jim said we may never come back, my first thought was, oh no.
Oh, I did too. I remember the first time I came back in here, and it was like coming back to like a ghost town, or coming back to a place that had it was from centuries ago, and you're revisiting it after everyone's gone. It was a very strange place to come. Now we're all back, and everything's like it was just it never happened before. And maybe not like quite like that, but it feels like we're all back to normal. And so many businesses are like that, but there's a lot that has changed that will never be the same, or will take a long, long time to recover. And one of those things that I think is going to still take a very long time to recover is the things that children lost in school. We think about the impact of children who were at home, and we were doing the best we could with virtual and whatever else. But the reality was kids were disconnected. They didn't learn as well. And it has resulted in lingering low test scores. You investigated that, Amanda, and we're still seeing it today.
Yeah. And the interesting thing with our investigation into learning loss, so this aired spring of 2021. And we looked at the 10 biggest school districts in our viewing area. We pulled the data. We chased down people who wouldn't talk to us about the data. But what we found was, yes, the schools that had remained closed showed poor test scores, suffering grades. So did the schools that opened. Because even though they were open, you have the quarantining, you have the regular disruption. Now all of schools got to close for 2 weeks. Everything was in such flux that even the kids who went back relatively soon, they still lost something.
And the New York Times put out a really great series of charts that sort of give you by the numbers the way things have changed. Some that have come back, some that have changed significantly. And this is one. It is a chart of U.S. test scores for 3rd through 8th grade. And in 2016, they're 0.2 years ahead of the 2019 baseline. So that's what they used as the measuring stick. But we hit 2020 and the scores drop like a rock. By 2022, they're a half year behind on average, and they've just started to come back, but we're still way behind 2019, which means there is still this great lag in what kids know at the ages they should know them compared to what they did before the pandemic.
Well, and then there's the academic portion of what they should know. And then there's the which is harder to measure the interpersonal
social isolation
of what they should know. And it was very much, it was so hard to know what to do. There was a lot of fear around that time. Kids pick up on that. They feel that. And it's something you even notice, especially during very formative years. And this isn't me saying everyone who was a kid during that time is permanently socially stunted, but there is a noticeable change. And my teacher friends will be the first to tell you that they're still not fully back from that.
One of the other charts that was in that New York Times list of charts was time socializing with others. This includes adults, not just kids. But in 2020, of course, that dropped like a rock, and it has barely come back. And I think that's the interesting thing, is the lingering social isolation. A lot of us got used to being at home. We got used to streaming and watching television shows at home and just not getting out and making those connections. And I think for a lot of people that developed habits that stick around to this day.
Well, and the emphasis on the nuclear family, which our society already had a lot, maybe more, not maybe, definitely more than some other countries. In the US, it's very nuclear family focused. And then that just got reinforced over and over and over during COVID because it was a safety thing. And so besides the electronic portion or what you're used to, I think just your network of people you were close to and who could help you or who you trusted, it got a lot smaller.
Remember Zoom happy hours?
Oh, yeah. But,
we did it so much. Like at this point, I was like, we're just drinking in front of a computer screen.
Do you know what I remember about that, though, is the first time it was a novelty. And we made the mistake of having a really big group, the Mexico group, who had just gotten back. Hey, let's all have a Zoom happy hour. We had 16 people on a Zoom.
Of course.
It was impossible to have a conversation because one person talks, another person talks over them.
Do you remember it was only an hour? An hour limit?
That was a limit. But we couldn't even make it the hour.
Right.
Because we looked
everyone's
at each
talking
other,
over it.
Denise and I, my wife and I looked at each other and we're like, this is not any fun
Sustainable.
because
Yeah.
it's not true socializing. And
It's
I
not
think
true connection.
it's not true connection. I think that's what we learned was we were doing our best to connect that way, but it wasn't the same. It never was the same. Do you remember when you think about like nursing homes, they were going out in the courtyard and people were out on their balconies and they were doing, singing choir songs.
Yes.
And I remember Italy was the first to shut everything down.
Yeah.
And they were the people in the windows just singing in the streets because it was the only way to connect, to hear other people's voices. But I think one of the things that was one of the great losses was for people who were in long-term care and people who died with family members who could not even come see them.
Yep.
And that's something you'll never get back. You can't go back and get that again.
Right.
And you see the decline. So my grandmother is French Canadian. She lives in Canada, and we did not see her for a long time, for a few years, because she wasn't allowed to come back across the border. So some of her grandchildren got married and she couldn't go. And you see the decline that definitely accelerated during that time.
What also was crazy to me is how quickly things shifted back, because I remember being, we're at a time where you'd go sit in a public meeting and the chairs are all spaced 6 feet apart, right? Yeah. And then the summer of 2021, we're only 6 months into having a vaccine, and the Milwaukee Bucks go to the NBA Finals, and the Deer District is shoulder to shoulder, a sea of people. And it was like, I thought this was never going to happen again. And there it was right here in Milwaukee. That was really where the Deer District came to be what it is.
Right. I know both of you had, like, your child was too young and yours were a little bit older. But if you've ever sat with a student who's in 4K on a Zoom with all other 4K kids, it's probably similar to that group of 16 from Mexico, because the teacher would ask a question and she wouldn't mute all the kids' mics. So one kid would be like, oh, I bought a pair of shoes once. And then little Billy would pop up and be like, my mom bought shoes and they're blue. You want to go see them? Sure, little Billy. And he'd run and go grab the shoe. Oh,
How do you do 4K over Zoom?
Miss Stark is a saint. So there's that. But I will say one of the things, and we were talking about being home and not really having any outlets. But one thing that kind of developed was that every Friday night we would watch a movie. We would all just be there. And to this day, we still do it. Every Friday, we're like, all right, what movie are we going to watch tonight? And it's just become a thing that, I know there's a lot that of, the challenges that came out of it that we were all dealing with. But I think at the end, spending that time with the family was, you have your ups and downs, but at the end, it's like, wow, we really got a lot of quality time. It really forced us, fortunately or unfortunately, to just slow down. We weren't going to events and the, kind of the joke now is like, oh, remember that time where we could just say, no, thanks, the pandemic. And now we're like, oh, that's not really an excuse anymore.
The happiest was our dogs.
Oh,
yeah.
So many walks too.
Every day.
Man.
They were loving every bit of that.
I did learn, though, that my husband and I cannot ever work together.
But
we could not start a business together. We could not, like, some couples can do those things. Both of us working from home are separate jobs at separate companies in the same space. It was not.
Oh, that wasn't even.
It was not good. Well, we just work so differently. Yeah. So I could work in short spurts and then do the other things and then handle that stuff. He needs long, uninterrupted time, but then he's easily distracted. And then I'm like, how long are your bathroom breaks, man? Like, it was just.
When we had a little mini meltdown, I imagined Steve on the other end going, "Glad it was him."
I mean, it was also Steve. It was, you act like it can only be one person at a time.
All right, so I want to wrap this up before we go off the record with this. What as you look back 5 years and now as you look ahead, I don't know, what do you think about, like, what do you take away from the pandemic experience, and what do you think if, like, how would we do if it happened again? Because it could.
Well, right. I think that we all were forced to rise above, like to be pushed to do things and be out of our comfort zone. And we navigated it together. So it's kind of like that trauma bonding where, we did it together. And so it wasn't just like I went through it by myself and nobody understands, but like we can all sit here. That's why we can talk for 38 minutes plus about this. And this episode could probably go for 3 episodes, based on everything. So I just think we all were forced to do the things, and we got it done. And it was, it was a lot along the way, but
we're still here.
Yeah, we all came out on the other side.
You, Amanda, what do you think?
I mean, I second all of that. I think it's also just parenthood is really an experience on its own. And I think the pandemic then highlighted, and we could do a whole separate episode on this, the challenges of specifically American parenting and parenting in today's society. So it really made me think a lot about how I parent and the independence or lack of independence we give our kids, and what that means, and what it means for them to have a village, and what it means for parents to have support and to have a village.
I think what I think about, and maybe this isn't going to be such a positive note at the end, I was hoping when it first happened that kind of like when 9/11 happened, it was a great unifier for a period of time. And of course that devolved back into everybody went into their camps. But I thought with the pandemic, this is so real and so severe that it's going to bring everybody together. And
you are
in fact,
so sweet.
I had hope. I mean, I had this sort of naive hope that would be the case. It was clear that it did the opposite. It only sent us further into our camps. And of course, social media, that's all we had to do was be online. And of course, it drove people even further into those corners. I now think, what if a pandemic came where it wasn't something that only killed the most vulnerable, the ones who are the elderly or the sickest? What if it was the kind of thing where you contract this, you're going to die? Would that change how we respond? No. And I now realize, no, it won't.
Doesn't matter.
It may result in civil war. It may result in absolute chaos. But I don't think anything's going to unify us.
Dude, you were right. This is a dark way.
It is.
Amanda should have gone last.
Sarah
should
have gone last.
Yes,
but I'll flip it on its head and say this. What I think was the greatest takeaway was that the people who are closest to you, the people who are very near to you, are really the only ones that matter when it comes down to it, because those are the people we spent time with, and being close to them is all we needed. I mean, I needed that other connection. I'm a social guy, but I was able to get through it during that time by just being around the people you love. I think that's the most important part.
Even with the occasional mini meltdown.
Even with the occasional mini meltdown. We will take a break and go off the record when we come right back. And it is time for us to go off the record. This is the part of the podcast where we get a little more casual and have a little fun by talking about things that have nothing to do with deadly pandemics. So, what do you have? We only have a couple of minutes, but what do you have in store?
Plot twist. No, I'm just kidding. This post-it is easy. It just says, what smell can't you handle? What is the worst smell on the planet?
Vomit.
Like child or any?
Any.
Well, I mean, I just mean, like, is that what you're thinking?
I have an affinity to pediatric vomiting. What?
Kid vomiting is fine, but grown-up vomiting is not. Well, like,
no.
Kid vomit.
No, I just meant like what was on your mind, because sometimes, like, if you have kids, it's trying to carry the bucket to
sympathy
the
puking.
Yeah, but we're just talking about the smell. We're not talking about like the
action. Yeah, okay.
We're having to clean it up. Yeah. For me, it's very much like sour milk, or like a dairy that has gone bad. So also, in that same vein, fruit that has gone
Well, that it's funny you say that.
Speaking
because
of vomiting,
I love eating broccoli. I like it. It's a good source of protein and other things. But broccoli smells awful when it goes bad. Broccoli and cauliflower.
Cauliflower's trash.
If you let cauliflower go too long in the fridge, I have a great moment of anxiety when I have to unseal to throw it away. That.
No.
Do it quick.
And I immediately wrap that double back and get it outside.
Oh, right, immediately.
Because if you don't, it's just going to ruin everything.
While we were sitting here, I was thinking, because Kale is sitting over there, and all I can think about is when we had our book club meeting and there were pickled eggs and things that are pickled in jars, and some spilled out some of the juice, the pickled juice, and that's the only time I've ever seen Kale. He's like, get this out of here, and he's grabbing. He's like, it smells so bad. We had to move rooms because the stink was
so bad,
horrible.
And then I thought like an air freshener would.
Air freshener.
It's like a Christmas tree air freshener.
You guys, it was because I had norovirus like 3 days before.
Fine.
Okay.
But normally you can handle
But
pickled
for real,
eggs.
olives.
Really?
Let's get olives. I can't smell
black
them.
olives?
Any olives.
Any olives.
Any olives.
Huh.
Okay.
Like Kale got up and walked to the microphone for
Literally.
that contribution.
It's one of the rare times I'm not on the page. Olives are okay to me. That's fine.
I love
but
olives.
raw chicken, if you let that, boy, you don't throw.
Okay, coming
don't
from
throw,
Mr. Chicken Cube.
That's why I cut chicken every week.
Full
Don't
circle.
throw the chicken scraps in your kitchen garbage and leave them there. It will
No,
ruin
thank you.
your week. Anyway, we're out of time. This
Life
week,
advice with
we're
Bryan.
going to wrap things up when we come right back. If you have a topic you would like us to discuss on Open Record or an issue you
Or
think we should
smell.
investigate for Fox 6 News, if you cut up too much chicken, leave it in the garbage, whatever it is, pickle juice on the counter, send us an email to fox6investigators@fox.com. With that, I am Bryan Polcyn, Amanda St. Hilaire, Sarah Smith, Kale Zimney, Tim Primo, who is running things today. Thanks to all of them, and we'll see you next week.